Mi nombre es Daniel Sobato y soy el director regional de Idea Internacional para América Latina y el Caribe. Y en compañía de Marco Herrera y Yarima Sosa constituimos el equipo de codirectores académicos que lidera este evento. El foro es bilingüe, por lo tanto tienen sobre la mesa los aparatitos para la traducción para aquellos que no manejan el español o el inglés, de manera tal de que podamos todos comunicarnos en cualquiera de los dos idiomas. Es un honor para mí darle la más cálida bienvenida a este sexto Foro Global 2023, una iniciativa conjunta de la Fundación Funglode y del Programa para América Latina y el Caribe de Idea Internacional, auspiciado por NTN 24, quien es nuestro media partner. Como en ediciones anteriores, el foro de este año también adopta un formato híbrido, permitiendo la participación tanto presencial aquí en la ciudad de Nueva York como virtual. Antes de continuar, deseamos extender un saludo especial al presidente Leonel Fernández y al secretario general de Idea Internacional, doctor Casas Zamora. Asimismo, expresamos nuestro profundo agradecimiento al Union League Club, que nos recibe una vez más, como ya es tradición, en estas emblemáticas y prestigiosas instalaciones. Siempre es un verdadero placer y un honor poder hacer nuestro foro en este histórico edificio. En tercer lugar, es un placer reconocer a todos nuestros ponentes, moderadores y moderadoras, cuya presencia, tanto física como virtual, con seguridad enriquecerá nuestras discusiones. Adicionalmente, deseo agradecer a mis colegas, Marco Herrera, director ejecutivo de la Fundación Funglode, y a Yarima Sosa, codirectora académica de este foro, junto a los equipos de Funglode y del Programa de América Latina y el Caribe de Idea Internacional. Su dedicación y esfuerzo han sido cruciales en la organización de este evento y su apoyo continuará siendo vital en el día de hoy y mañana. Este Foro Global 2023 nos ofrece una agenda intensa y enriquecedora con palabras de bienvenida, 2 conferencias magistrales, 7 paneles temáticos y una sesión de reflexión de cierre, programados para hoy, jueves 21, y mañana, viernes 22 de septiembre. Particularmente intenso va a ser el día de hoy, donde además de las 2 disertaciones inaugurales, vamos a tener 2 conferencias magistrales y 5 paneles, así que el tema del manejo del tiempo va a ser realmente muy importante, sobre todo al estar transmitiendo este evento de manera virtual. Además, nos complace sobremanera tener al profesor Joseph Stiglitz, laureado con el Premio Nobel de Economía en el año 2001, para presentar la conferencia magistral inaugural, donde abordará la situación económica global, la globalización en el actual escenario geopolítico y económico. Durante estos 2 días abordaremos temas cruciales a través de diferentes paneles, incluyendo el análisis sobre la situación geopolítica y económica global, que está caracterizada, como decíamos anoche en la inauguración con el presidente Fernández, no solamente por una policrisis, sino por una permacrisis, la situación de América Latina en el mundo, la coyuntura socioeconómica de la región, la intensa agenda electoral latinoamericana, así como discusiones sobre la inteligencia artificial y sus implicancias en diversos ámbitos, incluido en las elecciones, la política y la democracia, con destacados expertos en cada una de las áreas. Tenemos plena confianza que juntos podremos tomarle el pulso tanto al escenario global de policrisis como al momento crítico que vive nuestra región, nutriendo nuestras deliberaciones con las valiosas perspectivas de los conferencistas, panelistas, moderadores y participantes. A continuación, invito a hacer uso de la palabra al doctor Casas Zamora, secretario general de Idea Internacional. Doctor Casas Zamora.
Muy buenos días a todos y todas por estar acá. Hago mías las palabras de Daniel al decir que es un gusto estar de vuelta en el Union Club, la verdad. Quiero empezar por agradecer, como es menester, a Funglode, que ha sido un socio maravilloso en todos estos años, y por supuesto al presidente Leonel Fernández, que ha sido muy generoso al hacernos parte de este esfuerzo por ya varios años. Y nuestra participación en esto no hubiera sido posible de no ser por el esfuerzo denodado también de mi querido amigo y colega Daniel Sobato, que como en todo lo que ha hecho IDEA a lo largo de estos años en relación con América Latina, la fuerza motriz de todo ello ha sido Daniel. Y como se nos va Daniel a fin de año, aprovecho esta oportunidad para decirte, Daniel, que te vamos a echar de menos y que no hay forma. Va a venir alguien más a hacerse cargo del programa, pero no te van a reemplazar porque sos irreemplazable. ¿Ok? A ver, esta es, como de costumbre, una oportunidad para levantar los ojos y pensar en América Latina y en el mundo, más allá de las urgencias inmediatas. Eso es lo que permite este foro. Y cuando supe que debía decir estas palabras de inauguración, pensé que me tocaba decir un montón de cosas inteligentes sobre el futuro de América Latina. Y la verdad es que de eso se van a encargar otros acá abundantemente y en mucho mejor forma que como yo lo podría hacer. Para empezar, el profesor Stiglitz, no digamos. Entonces, pensé en hacer algo diferente. Y es que sucede que este año se cumplen 50 años de los golpes de Estado en Uruguay y Chile. Y tengo la sensación de que la conmemoración de esas dos tragedias nos da la oportunidad de extraer algunas lecciones muy pertinentes para la América Latina de hoy y de mañana. Lecciones que evidentemente son pertinentes para la discusión que aquí nos convoca. Y por supuesto, el contexto de estas lecciones es una América Latina donde la democracia está mucho más amenazada que en el pasado. La democracia ya no está garantizada en América Latina y está amenazada no por golpes militares, pero sí por la degradación de la práctica democrática que estamos viendo en muchos países de la región y en muchas partes del mundo, desatada casi siempre por líderes y gobiernos nacidos de las urnas. Lo que estamos viendo es una degradación del debate democrático, de la civilidad, de los frenos y contrapesos y de la noción de que el poder democrático, para hacerlo, no solo debe tener origen en la voluntad popular, sino también estar sujeto a controles. Y quizá el más importante de esos controles es la existencia de un elenco de derechos civiles y políticos que protegen el pluralismo, que permiten que quien gobierna rinda cuentas y que hacen posible que quien hoy es minoría mañana pueda convertirse en mayoría. La degradación progresiva de todos estos principios es una forma menos repentina y violenta de perder la democracia que los golpes de Estado de hace medio siglo, pero es igual de efectiva. Y el hecho de que sea más difícil de distinguir y de resistir la hace acaso más ominosa. La primera de esas lecciones derivadas de las tragedias de Uruguay y Chile es simplemente sobre la fragilidad de la democracia y el prohibitivo precio que se paga cuando se pierde. A ver, Uruguay y Chile, eran los casos buenos. En ninguno de esos dos casos se suponía que pasara lo que pasó. Y es que las democracias, aún buenas democracias, se degradan muy rápidamente cuando no todos los actores políticos tienen un compromiso incondicional con las reglas de juego. La democracia es muchas cosas, pero una muy importante es que es un sistema para resolver las diferencias en forma civilizada. Y esto requiere aceptar la legitimidad de mis adversarios y de quien no opina como yo. Esto requiere aceptar la inevitabilidad de que el proceso político va a arrojar resultados imperfectos, resultados negociados que no corresponden a todo lo que yo quiero, resultados imperfectos pero mejorables. Y eso requiere valorar las reglas de juego. Requiere la convicción de que las reglas de juego son más importantes que los resultados que arrojen en un momento dado. Era aquello que decía Albert Camus, de que en una democracia son los medios los que justifican a los fines. Esa actitud de valorar las reglas de juego y de comprometerse incondicionalmente con ellas es algo que rara vez ha sido parte de nuestra dinámica política en América Latina y que cada vez está menos seguro. Ese compromiso incondicional no lo tuvo buena parte de la izquierda en América Latina durante mucho tiempo. Y aquí me acuerdo el texto de García Márquez justamente sobre el presidente Allende. Decía García Márquez que al presidente Allende el destino le había deparado la rara y trágica grandeza de morir defendiendo a bala el mamarracho anacrónico del derecho burgués, toda la parafernalia polillada de un sistema de mierda. Bien pues, es mérito de las fuerzas democráticas en Uruguay y en Chile haber apostado su destino a esa parafernalia polillada cuando decidieron jugarse la vida, en el caso uruguayo en un referéndum en 1980 y en el caso chileno en el plebiscito de 1988, que acabaron en ambos casos en una derrota del proyecto autoritario. Porque el voto cuenta, los frenos y contrapesos cuentan, las libertades burguesas cuentan, porque al final, históricamente, no hay nada más revolucionario que un proyecto político fundado sobre la igualdad de derechos. La importancia de ese compromiso incondicional con las reglas de juego, caramba, es algo que debimos haber aprendido. Y eso hace, debo decir, tan alarmante ver a sectores de la derecha chilena, por ejemplo, justificar lo que pasó en 1973, porque sugiere que no han aprendido la lección y que su compromiso con la democracia sigue siendo condicional en el mejor de los casos. Y no solo en Chile, estamos viendo en un montón de lugares en América Latina la disposición de una buena parte del sistema político de sacrificar la democracia en el altar de dioses mayores o menores. En algunos casos la seguridad, en otros casos la lucha contra la corrupción, pero sacrificar la democracia. No hemos aprendido en el fondo la importancia de ese compromiso incondicional con las reglas de juego. La segunda solución es sobre la globalización y sus terribles efectos. En el caso de Chile, el golpe la profundizó terriblemente, amainó con el regreso a la democracia y ahora está volviendo a asomar la cabeza de la peor forma. Si algo debería mostrar la experiencia de Chile de estos 50 años, es que la polarización es casi siempre un boleto de ida y que no deja nada. Y eso es lo más triste, porque esta polarización, que no deja nada, está asomando en todos lados en la región, desafortunadamente, justo cuando nuestros países más necesitan grandes acuerdos sobre todos sus temas fundamentales. Cuando necesitan grandes acuerdos sobre cómo implementar nuestra productividad, sobre cómo sobre cómo enfrentar los enormes desafíos que plantean la crisis climática, el cambio tecnológico acelerado y la profundización de las divisiones geopolíticas. Sobre todo ello necesitamos grandes acuerdos. Y lo que vemos en todas partes es más y más polarización. Y la polarización, amigos y amigas, no le resolvió nunca un solo problema a nadie. Denunciar a nuestro adversario como ilegítimo, como irredimiblemente corrupto, como alguien indigno de sentarse a conversar en una mesa con nosotros, eso no le llenó nunca el estómago a un compatriota pobre. En el mejor de los casos, la retórica polarizante es predicar y no dar trigo. En el peor, es un instrumento que denota nuestro débil compromiso con las reglas de juego de la democracia para resolver nuestras diferencias en forma civilizada. Y si me preguntan viendo desde afuera, y aquí hay queridos amigos chilenos como Jorge, pero viendo desde afuera estos 50 años de la experiencia chilena, yo concluyo que Chile construyó más cuando entendió que debía hacerlo sobre la base de acuerdos, que fue en los años de la transición y en los años inmediatamente posteriores a la transición. Y los acuerdos que se forjaron en Chile fueron imperfectos, soslayaron temas cruciales, pero eran mejor que la alternativa, que era la polarización. Y francamente, yo nunca entendí bien el basureo de todo lo que construyó Chile tras la transición en la época de la concertación. Como tampoco he entendido bien el basureo por parte de algún sector de la izquierda de lo que representa la Constitución Española de 1978. Eso para mí es un misterio. Y no hablemos del caso de Uruguay, porque una de las cosas más importantes que ha hecho Uruguay desde la recuperación de la democracia en 1984 y que hoy lo separa claramente del resto de la región es conservar la civilidad política y la capacidad de construir acuerdos. Me viene a la mente una anécdota allá por el año 2014. Me tocó ir como invitado a la elección en Uruguay y la delegación esta con la que yo estaba, nos programaron una reunión con, entonces ya había sido presidente, pero en ese momento era candidato, Tabaré Vázquez, el día antes de la elección. Y fue extraordinario porque en la conversación, Vázquez nos dijo, mire, yo estoy seguro de que voy a ganar mañana, pero también estoy seguro que lo primero que tengo que hacer es agarrar el teléfono y llamar a mi contendor, al hoy presidente Lacalle Pou, que en ese momento era candidato y perdió. Lo primero que tengo que hacer es agarrar el teléfono y llamar a mi contendor, porque sé bien que tenemos que conversar para resolver una serie de temas fundamentales para el país. Y fue lo más extraordinario, porque según yo iba escuchando al presidente, al candidato Vázquez decir eso, me imaginaba tener esa misma reunión en ese mismo momento en el 2014 con doña Cristina Fernández o con el presidente Correa en Ecuador. Y estoy seguro que el tono hubiera sido otro. Bueno, eso es lo que Uruguay ha hecho bien. Muy claramente denotado, dicho sea de paso, para los que le prestaron atención a esto, en el gesto del presidente actual de Lacalle Pou de asistir a la toma de posesión del presidente Lula acompañado por el presidente Mujica y por el presidente Sanguinetti. Eso es Uruguay. Eso separa a Uruguay del resto de la región. Uruguay ha evitado la polarización destructiva, pese a que hay diferencias ideológicas importantes. Y esa capacidad para forjar acuerdos políticos está relacionada con algunas cosas fundamentales que ha hecho bien Uruguay en estas 4 décadas. Uruguay ha conservado sus partidos políticos más que ningún otro caso en América Latina. Los partidos en Uruguay tienen arraigo social, hay lealtad partidaria, la volatilidad electoral sigue siendo muy baja en Uruguay. Y Uruguay, y esto es clave, no ha satanizado la política. Uruguay ha reconocido desde siempre que la política es una profesión y que hay gente que se dedica toda la vida a ella y que eso es bueno. Yo no encuentro en Uruguay la aversión que uno ve en otras partes a la negociación y a la transacción, que es la savia de la política democrática. Una de las peores formas de populismo es la que ve en toda negociación política una componenda y una conspiración con oscuras intenciones. Y no sé, ¿será que el ejecutivo colegiado que tuvo Uruguay hace un siglo y el pacto del Chinchulín en 1931, por el que blancos y colorados se repartieron el Estado, yo creo que esas cosas curaron de espanto a los uruguayos, ¿verdad? La noción de que el ganador lo gana todo es completamente ajena a la experiencia democrática uruguaya. En Uruguay ninguna fuerza política obtiene todo lo que quiere, pero nunca nadie está totalmente fuera del poder. Los uruguayos entendieron y entienden que la opción a ese tipo de política es una política en donde uno se juega la vida en cada elección y al adversario se le termina viendo como enemigo. Y eso me recuerda una cosa muy ingeniosa que decía Adam Przeworski, un politólogo muy conocido, teórico de la democracia, que decía que la democracia funciona bien cuando lo que se juega en una elección está en el medio. No es ni muy poquito ni demasiado, sino algo en el medio. Si no se juega nada en la elección, es lo mismo para la gente por quien vote. Y la democracia no está funcionando. Y si se juega demasiado en la elección, si nos jugamos la vida en cada elección, aquello se vuelve inmanejable. Entonces la democracia funciona cuando lo que está cuando lo que está en el asador está en el medio. Y me acuerdo de una frase que le oí decir a José Mujica, alguna vez que lo entrevistaron y le estaba hablando de la necesidad de construir acuerdos sobre algunos temas fundamentales, y decía Mujica: aquí en Uruguay la pesada de los partidos va a tener que reunirse a tomar mate. Bueno, eso es una democracia que funciona. Y el activo rechazo a la polarización y a los discursos polarizantes como una patología de la democracia tiene un corolario que creo que la experiencia de Chile, tanto la reciente como la de hace 50 años, lo muestra, me parece muy bien. Miren, yo creo que hay que ser un poquito desconfiado de los proyectos políticos refundacionales que tratan de cambiar demasiadas cosas demasiado pronto. Esos proyectos o terminan echando mano de la fuerza para ejecutar los cambios o terminan desatando fuerzas reaccionarias que no pueden controlar y que acaban con la democracia. En cualquier caso, es muy difícil que un proyecto refundacional tenga éxito en un marco democrático. Miren, yo soy un gradualista inveterado que entiende la democracia como una colcha de retazos, más o menos, como una colcha de retazos que vamos construyendo, que vamos tejiendo entre todos, que no es parejita ni armónica, pero que con un poco de suerte funciona y calienta. Yo soy un convencido de lo que Karl Popper llamaba el piecemeal social engineering, la ingeniería social fragmentaria, que va cambiando la sociedad poquito a poquito. Esas reformas casi siempre son las más duraderas y ciertamente son las que tienen la mayor probabilidad de ser adoptadas sin poner en riesgo a la democracia. Dejo mis palabras aquí. Sirva todo esto para decir que al conmemorar en estos días el medio siglo de las tragedias de 1973 en Uruguay y en Chile, también abrigo la esperanza de que reflexionemos sobre algunas de estas cosas en este foro diseñado como está para la reflexión. porque sospecho que estas lecciones pueden resultar útiles en medio del panorama sombrío que rodea la democracia en América Latina en estos días. Porque yo genuinamente creo que es el compromiso incondicional con la democracia como un conjunto de reglas de juego para procesar nuestras diferencias, que es la disposición de sentarnos a dialogar con nuestros adversarios y de alcanzar acuerdos imperfectos, que es la actitud de abrazar el gradualismo como método de acción política. Es todo eso lo que le puede decir al mundo que los latinoamericanos de verdad estamos convencidos de que lo que pasó hace 50 años no debe pasar nunca más, y que estamos decididos, por fin, a abrir las anchas alamedas por las que caminemos hacia una sociedad no perfecta, sino simplemente mejor. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctor Kevin Casas Zamora, secretario general de Idea Internacional, por su análisis riguroso y por sus elocuentes palabras, citando claramente los casos de Uruguay y los de Chile, que realmente están muy presentes y estarán muy presentes en la reflexión del día de hoy y de mañana. Seguidamente tendremos el honor de escuchar las palabras inaugurales del doctor Leonel Fernández, quien ha ejercido la presidencia democrática en la República Dominicana en 3 ocasiones y es miembro fundador y presidente honorario de Funglode. Presidente Fernández.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome once again to this new edition of the Global Forum on Latin America and the Caribbean. And having said that, since I know there are translators, I will shift into Spanish. Bueno, muy buenos días, doctor Kevin Casas Zamora, secretario general de Idea Internacional, presidente Carlos Mesa, Daniel Sobato, director regional para América Latina y el Caribe, distinguidos amigos y amigas. Al igual que Chile y Uruguay, que hace 50 años experimentaron un colapso de su sistema democrático, justamente en este mes se conmemoran 60 años del golpe de Estado contra el primer gobierno democrático electo en la República Dominicana después de la larga dictadura de Rafael Leónidas Trujillo. En efecto, el próximo lunes, 25 de septiembre, son 60 años contra el golpe de Estado al gobierno de Juan Bosch. Y bueno, sabemos las consecuencias de ese golpe de Estado. En lo inmediato, una insurrección popular ocurrida en abril de 1965, y como consecuencia de esa insurrección popular que procuraba el retorno a la constitucionalidad y de Juan Bosch al poder, se produjo entonces la segunda intervención militar norteamericana a la República Dominicana. El año próximo se cumplirán 100 años de la salida de las tropas de Estados Unidos de su primera intervención, y 1965 la segunda intervención como respuesta a la insurrección popular que procuraba el restablecimiento del orden constitucional. Desde hace 40 años, sin embargo, 4 décadas, República Dominicana vive una estabilidad democrática, que es lo que ha permitido crear un clima adecuado para la inversión nacional e internacional, y por consiguiente que la República Dominicana se haya convertido en uno de los países con mayor nivel de crecimiento económico, mayor expansión de la clase media y naturalmente un natural crecimiento de su infraestructura. Un país que avanza hacia la modernización, pero la base de eso ha sido fundamentalmente la estabilidad política democrática conquistada, que permite certidumbre en el sistema político, elecciones cada 4 años, y por tanto nadie piensa que pueda haber golpe de Estado militar o guerrilla de izquierda. En República Dominicana la única forma legítima y legal de acceso al poder es por vía electoral, y el progreso y la prosperidad dependen de ese clima de estabilidad política democrática. Dicho eso, un poco comparto con ustedes algunas ideas de nuestra interpretación de la situación mundial actual. En la reciente cumbre del G20, celebrada en Nueva Delhi, en la India, Se sostenía de entrada que el mundo se encuentra en estos momentos en un momento decisivo de su historia y que dependiendo de las decisiones que se adopten, sabremos si podremos avanzar o seguirá un retroceso en todo el mundo. Y se planteaban las 4P. Las 4P son el planeta, los pueblos, la paz y la prosperidad, que son los 4 temas que deben ser abordados. En estos momentos, como todos sabemos, sin embargo, vivimos empezando una crisis económica. Las proyecciones para el crecimiento económico mundial son sombríos. Para la economía global se proyecta un crecimiento de un 3%. Para América Latina y el Caribe, este año 2023, de acuerdo con informes de la CEPAL, el crecimiento será tan solo de 1.7%. Y para el año próximo, 2024, todavía peor. Las proyecciones son de que América Latina en conjunto tendrá un magro crecimiento de 1.5% del PIB. Bueno, es lo que estamos viendo ya en esta fase post-pandemia. Como sabemos, fruto de la pandemia del COVID-19, la economía mundial y la economía latinoamericana experimentaron una severa contracción, menos 8.7% del Producto Interno Bruto. Y para enfrentar esa severa contracción de la economía mundial y regional, la respuesta fue la aplicación por parte de 92 bancos centrales en el mundo, fue la aplicación de una política monetaria expansiva. Esa política monetaria, aplicada a finales del 2020, 2021 y parte del 2022, tuvo como resultado una reactivación económica que vivimos en el año 2021. Una expansión llevada a cabo por esa política monetaria expansiva. Bueno, y hago un paro porque en este momento está ingresando el profesor Joseph Stiglitz, para quien pido un fuerte aplauso. Profesor Stiglitz, thank you. Thank you so much for your presence, Profesor Stiglitz. Okay. Bueno, entonces decía que esa política de reactivación post-pandemia se logra sobre la base de, digamos, colocar mayores recursos financieros en los mercados. Sin embargo, la política monetaria expansiva ha generado como resultado también inflación. La más grande inflación conocida en la región y en el mundo en los últimos 40 años. Al entenderse el problema inflacionario, entonces se han aplicado políticas monetarias distintas. De una política monetaria expansiva estamos ahora en una política monetaria restrictiva que se manifiesta con el alza de las tasas de interés por parte de los bancos centrales. Al adoptar esas políticas monetarias restrictivas, entonces estamos experimentando una disminución del crecimiento económico. Por tanto, estamos en un ciclo. Política monetaria expansiva, crean reactivación, pero generan inflación y ahora se aplican políticas monetarias restrictivas, pero que generan bajo crecimiento. Ahora bien, este tema económico no se ha iniciado con la pandemia. Ya desde antes de la pandemia teníamos algunas dificultades. En América Latina, los años 2003 al 2013 son considerados como la edad de oro, 10 años de crecimiento continuo. Pero la razón fundamental fue el crecimiento de China. China estaba creciendo a un 12% promedio anual y se convirtió en la locomotora del crecimiento fundamentalmente de América del Sur, exportando commodities, petróleo, gas natural, soya, cobre, etc. Si disminuye el crecimiento de la economía en China, pues iba a afectar seriamente a la economía de Sudamérica fundamentalmente, porque Centroamérica y el Caribe dependen más de la economía norteamericana. Bueno, pasado ese periodo del 2003-2013, de ahí en adelante, el quinquenio 2014-2019, América Latina crece mediocremente un 0,5%. Ahora, ese bajo crecimiento económico se va a manifestar en una situación de crisis social y crisis política. Las protestas latinoamericanas tienen lugar en ese momento y desde el año 2017 en adelante, con 19 elecciones presidenciales que han tenido lugar en América Latina, los partidos oficialistas, los gobiernos han perdido 17 de esas 19 elecciones. Solamente en 2 los gobiernos han logrado ser reelectos, lo que indica esa relación que existe entre tendencia global de la economía e impacto político electoral que está teniendo en los países de la región. Ahora, el tema va mucho más allá, mucho más allá de lo que pasa en el periodo prepandemia 2014-2019 y lo que pasa con la pandemia y esta pospandemia en la que nos encontramos. Yo creo que para buscar una explicación racional a lo que ocurre en el mundo y lo que ocurre en América Latina hay que situarse más bien en el momento del fin de la Guerra Fría y el nuevo orden mundial que empieza a construirse y dónde han estado las fallas de ese nuevo orden mundial en construcción. Con el fin de la Guerra Fría, estamos hablando ya de 3 décadas, hace 3 décadas, el nuevo orden que surge se plantea primero una nueva era de la globalización y segundo una nueva revolución tecnológica. Y esa nueva revolución tecnológica todavía está en curso y en constante evolución y vamos a tocarlo aquí en este foro de reflexión porque habrá varios paneles sobre el tema de inteligencia artificial y cómo la inteligencia artificial está incidiendo, ¿no?, en la actualidad. Con respecto al tema de globalización, que es uno de los temas, digamos, de mayor pasión para el profesor Stiglitz y de lo cual nos hablará en su intervención, la globalización siempre tuvo partidarios y opositores, digamos, hiperglobalistas, optimistas y globalistas escépticos, para decirlo de alguna manera. La izquierda siempre estuvo en desacuerdo con el fenómeno globalización sobre la base de que había una relación asimétrica en lo que concierne a la liberalización comercial, que países en desarrollo no podían competir con los países desarrollados, puesto que de entrada había una situación de desigualdad. Y esa fue digamos, el argumento fundamental de la izquierda para oponerse al fenómeno de la globalización. Vimos las protestas en Seattle, las protestas en Toronto, protestas en Génova. Como consecuencia del fenómeno globalizador se planteaba la alterglobalización o globalización con rostro humano. Pero ya luego en el tiempo también hemos visto una crítica de la derecha al fenómeno de la globalización, con un concepto diferente. La derecha reacciona a la globalización sobre la base de que se han perdido los empleos de la industrialización, que se han ido fundamentalmente a Asia y sobre todo a China. Esa desindustrialización de los países capitalistas desarrollados lo ven fundamentalmente como reacción al fenómeno globalizador. Pero la globalización fue al mismo tiempo que apertura comercial, liberalización de los mercados, fue también financiarización de la economía. Ambas cosas. Y naturalmente son estos 2 factores los que van a crear una tensión en la sostenibilidad del sistema económico global. Sobre todo en lo que concierne a la financiarización de la economía, porque crea la crisis financiera global del año 2008 y esa crisis financiera global se va a superar, como ha sido con la pandemia, mediante la aplicación de políticas monetarias cuantitativas, quantitative easing, como le llamaron en Estados Unidos, pero que se prolongaron justamente hasta la etapa de la pandemia, de manera que cuando hay que reaccionar económicamente frente a la pandemia con una política monetaria expansiva ya venía desde el año 2008, con lo cual trillones de dólares fueron colocados en los mercados internacionales, generando la inflación por la cual todavía estamos viviendo y que los bancos centrales no terminan de seguir incrementando las tasas de interés. Reacción política, tanto desde la derecha como desde la izquierda, entonces, al fenómeno globalizador, el populismo. Políticas populistas, que desde el punto de vista político implicaron el irrespeto a la institucionalidad democrática y desde el punto de vista económico la vuelta al proteccionismo. Elevar aranceles para dificultar las importaciones provenientes de países con bajos salarios, con países que habían sido receptores de los flujos de capitales, ¿no?, que migraron considerando que había mercados más amplios y por lo tanto crecieron mucho hasta convertirse en rival de los Estados Unidos, ¿verdad? el fenómeno globalizador, esa apertura comercial, ese flujo de capitales, la liberalización financiera también permitió el surgimiento de China como segunda gran potencia económica. Y ese es el otro tema del mundo contemporáneo. Además de un fracaso de la globalización, porque obviamente la globalización en general ha fracasado, ya se habla del fin de la globalización, de una desglobalización en el momento en que nos encontramos, ¿verdad? A pesar de que, desde otro punto de vista, también la globalización fue positiva en el sentido de que produjo una mayor interconexión y una mayor interdependencia a nivel mundial. O sea, que tiene sus luces y sus sombras, pero en el momento actual lo que se está viendo es un proceso de desglobalización, sobre todo en la rivalidad comercial China-Estados Unidos, con la vuelta a la utilización de los aranceles como un mecanismo de freno del comercio mundial. Bueno, desde el punto de vista entonces político, el populismo, el nacionalismo y el proteccionismo es la respuesta que ha habido frente a esta situación de debilidades del fenómeno globalizador. Pero el mundo se enfrenta, y es digamos, por lo cual se le llama el momento decisivo de la historia en que nos encontramos, a viejos problemas que tienen que ver con rivalidades entre superpotencias, ahora Estados Unidos con China, pero también la resurrección de Rusia como potencia, la guerra de Rusia en Ucrania, la primera guerra entre estados desde la Segunda Guerra Mundial, y eso crea un panorama, digamos, distinto al que habíamos pensado en la posguerra fría. Se combinan entonces factores geopolíticos de antaño con los nuevos desafíos entonces que tienen que ver con el cambio climático, desafíos que tienen que ver con la pandemia y la nueva proliferación nuclear. Entonces lo que tenemos es viejos problemas geopolíticos que se combinan con nuevos desafíos y el mundo se encuentra en la intersección de esos dos desafíos. Y naturalmente, frente a un mundo dividido, frente a un mundo que empieza a crearse como en especie de bloques, el bloque asiático con China en el dominio del Mar del Sur de la China y el Indo-Pacífico, y la alianza transatlántica representada por la OTAN. Un mundo fragmentado. Pero frente a ese mundo fragmentado tiene que haber una respuesta, y la respuesta tiene que ser necesariamente una respuesta que tiene que venir de la institución con mayor capacidad de convocatoria en el mundo, que se llama Naciones Unidas. Y Naciones Unidas tiene que volver a replantearse la necesidad de cumplir con los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible 2030, que de acuerdo a lo que se ha indicado en estos días solamente ha logrado cumplir un 15% de su meta. Y por lo tanto hay que volver a insistir en la necesidad de que la forma de avanzar en reducción de pobreza, en creación de condiciones de equidad social, de modernización, de progreso, tiene que ver con la aplicación de los Objetivos 2030. Pero eso significa también a su vez la cooperación internacional, replantearse el tema de la deuda para los países en desarrollo, volver a políticas de transición energética, cómo eliminar el uso de los combustibles fósiles, carbón, petróleo, gas natural, para ser sustituido por una energía renovable limpia. El tema de la transición digital, necesariamente el mundo tiene que ir hacia una transición energética y una transición digital. Y ya luego los desafíos que va a tener el impacto tecnológico, porque es el Internet, que nos trajo el Internet de las cosas, es una inteligencia artificial que se va a combinar con biología sintética y computación cuántica, con lo cual el mundo se va a acelerar extraordinariamente, y si eso no tiene un carácter inclusivo, entonces la brecha entre el mundo rico y el mundo pobre se va a ampliar aún más, trayendo mayores tensiones sociales, multiplicando la migración masiva internacional y creando, por tanto, un mundo en caos, un mundo en crisis que sería ingobernable. Tarea fundamental de Naciones Unidas para poder tener eficacia en la construcción de un mundo global incluyente, equitativo, tiene que ser la construcción de una gobernanza global que actualmente no existe. El tema es que hemos tenido una globalización donde las economías han tenido que adaptarse a los requerimientos de la globalización. Ahora necesitamos una globalización donde ésta se adapte a las necesidades de los pueblos. Si la globalización no se adapta a las necesidades de los pueblos, sino al revés, tendremos un mundo en conflicto permanente. Y ese es el tema de nuestros tiempos. Si estamos en un momento decisivo, es el momento de tomar decisiones que son fundamentales para garantizar la estabilidad y la convivencia pacífica de los pueblos. Esos serán los temas que discutiremos durante estos próximos días. El papel de la inteligencia artificial, ¿no?, como mecanismo también acelerador de la productividad y del cambio social. Espero que sea de provecho, que salgamos de estos encuentros más enriquecidos intelectualmente y con una visión más clara de lo que el mundo necesita para una transformación en favor de las mayorías. Muchas gracias y que disfruten este encuentro. And now it is my honor and my pleasure to introduce Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who is a full professor at Columbia University, but is also a recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize in 2001 for his work as an economist and also as an activist for implementation of public policies in favor of the majority of the people. He has written, I would say, classical works now: Globalization and its Discontents, Making Globalization Work, and many other books that are of reference in many languages around the world. So it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce to you Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Professor, you have the floor.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and there are so many subjects of interest going on, and that one could talk about at this moment. But I'm going to focus on just one, which has already been hinted at, rethinking globalization. There are major changes in globalization that are underway, many of which will affect Latin America and the Caribbean. They'll affect Africa. They'll affect countries all over the world. There are four major drivers of these changes that I want to talk about, and I'll describe them and then very briefly outline some of the ways in which the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean will have to respond to these changes. The first is the new global geopolitical, geoeconomic structure. After World War II, there was the hope that borders would no longer matter. Of course, Russia has said borders don't matter, and just walked across the border and tried to invade Ukraine, but that's not what we talked about. We went, borders didn't matter for trade, movements of goods, for economic purposes. The pandemic showed that borders did matter. Countries hoarded their pandemic products, their vaccines, their therapeutics, in violation of all the WTO rules. So when the pandemic occurred, we had a set of rules in place at the WTO, but the powerful countries, most importantly the United States, simply tore up those rules and said protecting our citizens is more important than obeying the rules, even though we talk all the time about a rules-based order, and we criticize other countries that violate the rules. And that led to a sense in many countries that we had created a set of rules that work for that were written by the rich and powerful, by the United States and Europe, for them, but when they were inconvenient for the advanced countries, they weren't obeyed. So a system of rules that only apply to the weak is not a rules-based system. And the pandemic exposed that. The United States have been the most strongest advocate of a rules-based system where borders didn't matter for decades after World War II. But then suddenly we went from that kind of framework to one in which we use words like nearshoring, onshoring, and then most particularly friendshoring. One of the finance ministers of one of the large Latin American countries told me that he had asked the Secretary of Treasury, were they a friend? And the Secretary of Treasury looked aghast that hadn't even thought about how you define who are friends and not. It was obvious that officially NAFTA, Canada and Mexico were friends, so long as Trump was not president. And when he was president, not even Canada was sure that it was a friend. But the rest of Latin America, yes, we wanted them to be friends, but we weren't sure. We hadn't figured out whether production from Brazil or Chile was friendshoring. So we had articulated a framework that was not very clear and left a lot of ambiguity. Europe approached the issue in a little bit more, I would say, intelligent way, and they started talking about de-risking. And I want to emphasize how important that concept is. De-risking means that you don't rely on a particular source of a particular country for your inputs, critical inputs, or for that matter, for your exports. We have come to realize that in many areas we took on the doctrine of borders not mattering so seriously that we focused on what was the cheapest source regardless of the risk that it posed. Germany showed how foolish it was to become so dependent on Russian gas. I had written in one of my books that was referred to, Making Globalization Work, in 2006, that it was very foolish for Germany to be so dependent on Russian gas. At that moment, things looked fine, but I said you didn't have to be a genius to figure out Putin was not a reliable person. And, energy is an important input. Renewable energy has a certain risk. It may not shine, the sun may not shine, the wind may not blow. But authoritarian leaders like Putin are even more unreliable. And you know that the sun may not shine one day, but it'll shine the next day. We don't know when this war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, will be over. So it would have paid Europe, it would have paid the United States to have become much more reliant on renewable energy rather than to be so reliant not just on the authoritarian leadership in Russia, but in Saudi Arabia and many of the other countries. We know that fossil fuels are disproportionately concentrated in the countries where there are authoritarian leaders. And we know, too, that climate, renewable energy, is more equitably distributed. So even apart from saving the planet, it would have made good economic sense to diversify, but we didn't. But the risks associated with the excessive dependence of many Latin American countries on China does pose a risk. You know, some countries in Latin America are now exporting 80% of some of their critical goods to China. It is a major source of revenue. And right now, things look, you know, reasonably good. China's not managed its way through the post-pandemic world. We didn't look like we were managing our way very well for the first year, but I think things now look like we're actually coming back and doing things reasonably well. So there's a lot of internal uncertainty about China. We could talk about that later, that a lot of risk about its economic growth, and anybody dependent on China ought to worry about that. But there's a much more significant risk that there will be a conflict. In particular, President Xi has announced that there are 3 major objectives in his term of office. You know, officially another 4 years. We don't know how long he'll stay on. Authoritarian leaders don't always leave in an orderly way, in a predictable way. But his 3 commitments are growth, shared prosperity, which is he doesn't mean what we mean when we say common, you know, shared growth. It's a different concept, and again, we can talk about that. But the third objective that he has announced is taking over Taiwan. And that would be, you might say, of concern. And a particular concern given the stance that the U.S. government, the Republicans and Democrats have taken. So you can agree or disagree whether U.S. foreign policy makes sense in this area, but the reality is the only thing the Republicans and Democrats agree on is China. And that fact means that it is very difficult for either of the 2 parties to soften their policy. If they showed any inclination to soften, the other party will bash them. So unfortunately, the reality is that there's going to be you might say, a tough China policy going forward. And unfortunately, again, President Xi has reinforced, you know, there are many reasons for this. Some people like Ramausen talk about the Thucydides trap, and others talk, you know, competition, others talk about other reasons, but the reality of the 2 parties agreeing on this one thing, and President Xi saying he will take over Taiwan, he took over Hong Kong, and President Xi supporting Russia in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, all makes for, so I put it mildly, tension in this area. And that's where the word de-risking comes in. You know, you don't have to take a stance on whether this is right or wrong. As a business person, as a government, you have to say there's a risk. And anybody who is in a decision-making position has to take on, part of their analysis has to be de-risking. And what that entails may differ from company to company and country to country, but it does put Latin America in a difficult position because over the last 20 years, it's become very highly dependent on China. So this is the first driver of these changes in globalization that will be going on. The second is climate change. There's a certain irony here. The world I just described is splitting apart, and yet as we address the issue of climate change, we realize we live in the same planet. You know, I sometimes talk about it as if you are on the Titanic and the ship is sinking and you're put in a lifeboat, there may be some people in the lifeboat that you don't like, but the first order of business is to get to shore. And that needs to be the first order of business of the world. It is an existential threat. It was predictable. A lot of people, particularly in the oil, coal, gas, fossil fuel industry said, oh no, it's a hoax. It's not a hoax. You know, we know this as much as we know almost anything with scientific certainty. And to me, it's a beautiful achievement of science where if you understand quantum mechanics, it was predicted at the end of the 19th century before they could measure what was going on. They understood the possibility that there would be these greenhouse gas effects. So to me, I began my career as a physicist. The idea that you make a prediction and then 100 years later, you can test the prediction. And guess what? You're right. And so it has a kind of, you might say, logic, theory behind it. And now we have the experience. And the consequences of not dealing with it will be enormous. The cost will be enormous. So the world, it's a global problem, and therefore there will have to be global cooperation. So there's this tension here between, on the one hand, the world is going back to a new kind of Cold War, but it's going to be different from the old Cold War because we are going to have to work together to solve the problem of climate change. Climate change is going to affect things in another way. The high price of fossil fuels is probably going to increase, almost surely, the cost of transportation. And there will be strong movements to localizations. There are a lot of restaurants now that are, feature, we only have local goods. But the reality is that the cost of transportation, of shipping, will probably go up relative to other goods. And the result of that is that one of the drivers of globalization, the closer integration of countries, was that the cost of transportation had gone down. This is going to be reversed. Right now, the shipping industry is working hard to figure out how to become green. And there are a lot of ideas bouncing around, but it still is one of the areas that is going to be hardest for resolving. And that brings me to the third driver of change in globalization, and that's the structure of production is going to change. One aspect of the change in the structure of production is related to climate change. The source of our energy is going to change from fossil fuels. The countries have committed themselves, most countries, to being carbon neutral by 2050. Some of the developing countries talk about 2060. I think there'll be pressure to accelerate that as the evidence of climate change becomes stronger. But I think the advantages of moving to renewable energy are enormous, as I said before, but they also are associated with changes in the structure of production. Renewable energies are more decentralized. They entail a different structure of energy grids, and that will be one of the changes. And because of the more localized area, at least this aspect of globalization will change. But there's another one that is going to play an important role. As we've gotten wealthier, the composition of GDP has moved very strongly to services. In the United States, manufacturing is about 9% of GDP, 9% of employment, probably a little bit less than that. When you read in economics textbooks, you think about the production of steel, we talk of widgets, goods, and relatively homogeneous goods, where competition is fairly strong. But the 21st century economy is about services, and services are markedly different. A lot of services are inherently local. You can't buy a haircut globally. You have to go to a local barber. That's an extreme case, but even if you, say, in agriculture, you buy a tractor that's globally traded, most of your spending is going to be on the servicing of the tractor, and that's going to be local. And that means as a fraction of GDP, there will be a decline in trade. Even if there are some trading services, it's more difficult. And so there's going to be, as a fraction of GDP, globalization trade is going to be less important. Let me put it like that. And finally, the most important change in globalization is a change in ideology and beliefs. That was already referred to. Globalization has been criticized on the left and on the right. Trump was unhappy for one set of reasons, some notions of national sovereignty, which he didn't really understand very well. All contracts are restraints, and you make a contract because the better restraints, what you get, are worth the restraints. So, but it is criticized on the left, but it's all on the right, but it's also criticized on the left. On the left, the concern is about what globalization has been done to jobs. Maybe I should say up front, as an economist, economics has come to the view, I think, that the importance of globalization was exaggerated. That the magnitude of the benefits of globalization in terms of economic growth were exaggerated. But the distributive effects, how it affects the distribution, was underestimated. So some people, some groups did very, very well with globalization. But economic theory predicted, and the outcome is consistent with this, that unskilled labor wages would go down. And that is only one factor, but I think it's a very important. Others emphasize the role of technology, and that too, either of them alone would have had a very bad effect on inequality, but the two together have a really big effect. In the United States, real wages at the bottom are roughly the same as they were 65 years ago. So if you want to understand why there's some discontent among white, male, unskilled workers, you can understand. They have not done very well. And the broader set of market ideology has not worked very well. As you know, you probably, life expectancy in the United States is lower than virtually any other advanced countries. But what we excel at is inequality in life expectancy. No other country approaches us in the inequalities in life expectancy. And one number that sticks out to me is the fact that the life expectancy among, we call Native Americans, what Canadians call First Nations, the indigenous Americans, the life expectancy of those is lower than in any country in the Western Hemisphere other than Haiti. And as you know, Haiti is at the bottom and has terrible problems right now. But that is the average life expectancy of the Native Americans. We have failed large groups of Americans. And life expectancy has been on decline, was on decline before the pandemic, but then because the inequalities in health conditions are so great, the United States experienced an enormous decline in life expectancy during the pandemic. So it was already declining, and now it's declined even more. So we're in a context in which a set of ideas that were sometimes called neoliberalism, that said, trust the market, it will deliver, have come under question. And the foundations of the rules of globalization were really based on these ideas of neoliberalism. So you have the result of this is you have this mixture of a geopolitics and a geoeconomics splitting the world, and at the same time, the foundation of the belief system in the United States that was argued for in the integrated world has been destroyed. And the result is the practice, the implementation of globalization has been very adverse. So the way I sometimes put it, if the WTO is, if not dead, it's on its deathbed. Nobody says, the WTO is dead, but the U.S. has done everything to kill it. Let me just give you two examples that illustrate if you have an agreement about trade, almost inevitably you're going to have some disputes. I mean, that's just the nature of life. And you have to have some mechanism for resolving those disputes. And when the WTO was created, they created a mechanism for resolving them. You have courts. And they have an appellate court process. And they actually work pretty well for a long time. I've known some of the judges, and they're very smart people. They come with a particular view, not surprisingly, that they spent their life thinking about trade and under the idea that free trade was a good idea, so they have a certain mindset, but they were very bright people. But they rotate, as you would hope any system, and they leave, and then you have to appoint new judges. But the rules of the WTO are that there has to be consensus on the appointment of new judges, and the U.S. has said no. So there are now not enough judges for the WTO appellate system to work. There is no court anymore. And if you have no court, you have no way of disciplining people who break the rules. And we did that, I think, deliberately, because one of the countries breaking the rules most significantly is the United States. And we don't want the WTO to tell us that we've broken the rules. And the one example that I'm going to come back to, and really important, is this context in which we've broken the rules, I think, for a good reason, but it's still breaking the rules. And that is the CHIPS Act and the IRA Act. The CHIPS and Science Act, some $50 billion to help de-risk the American economy because we were overly dependent on Taiwan chips, was an important act that will move us to have more in the United States, more independence on chips from Taiwan. But then we passed what's called the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, relatively little to do with inflation, but Manchin insisted that we call it that in order, because he doesn't like industrial policy. But after lecturing countries around the world that they should not have industrial policies, the United States has now, we always had industrial policies, they were hidden in the Defense Department, but now we've openly endorsed industrial policies for the green economy. I think it's good in the sense that we needed to accelerate the move to the green economy. The market was not moving fast enough, and we needed the government to push us faster. It's a matter of, I would say, life and death. So it was a right decision, but it was against the WTO rules. The WTO rules are trying to create a level playing field, and one aspect of that was no subsidies. Well, it wasn't quite that way because when the WTO was created, the U.S. and Europe were very powerful, as they still are, and they said we need to subsidize our farmers because otherwise Congress won't approve it. So there are no subsidies on the part of poor countries, but rich countries were allowed to subsidize their farmers. It was a little bit of an inconsistency in what went on. Well, I don't know if you know how much those subsidies are. They were officially, CBO scored them, evaluated the subsidies, at $271 billion. Yeah, that's a lot of money, and most countries couldn't compete. Even Europe complained that we had unleveled the playing field. But I think it was a great bill because while it was scored by CBO at $271 billion, right now the estimate is that it was actually a bill of between $1 and $1.5 trillion. So it's working. But the fact that it's working is creating a very unlevel playing field. I spent a lot of time in Europe and Latin America, and I talked to senior policymakers in both, and they are all very unhappy. They're the ones that are talking about the numbers of $1 and $1.5 trillion. You don't see that covered in American press, but then you look up and you say, I hear that, and then I looked it up, and Brookings estimated at over $1 trillion, and that was several months ago, and the number now is much larger than that. Well, so in that sense, we've walked away from the WTO. But it's even more explicit than that. Jake Sullivan gave a talk at, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, gave a talk at Brookings, where he tried to, he's a good thinker, and he tried to articulate the U.S. position. But it was a very U.S.-centric answer. What he said was, the rule in effect, and I'm caricaturing, but I think I'm getting it right. He said, well, we wrote the rules, and when they work for us, we obeyed the rules. But we're in the 21st century, and the rules that we wrote don't suit us anymore. And because they don't suit us anymore, we're not going to obey them. And we want to rewrite those rules in the way we want to rewrite those rules. And when we rewrite the rules, we'll obey the new rules that we've rewritten. Well, that's a world without rules, where we get to write the rules, whatever is needed to work for us. Now, he did spend some time blaming China. He said, China doesn't obey the rules. Well, there's an interesting thing about this. If the U.S. really believed that China didn't obey the rules, they should have gone to the WTO court and said, China has disobeyed the rules. We have a legal procedure. They have to stop. But that's not what we did. We didn't even file a case. Of course, there's no court, which we stopped, but we didn't even file a case. And what were we really saying? And this is something that they didn't obey the rules that we would have liked to have made. They're the rules we have in our mind. And the rules that we advocated, but unfortunately, we didn't get all the rules that we wanted. So we wanted rules that would say on investment agreements, you can't force a country, you can't force joint ventures. And Europe forced that rule on Canada. Okay, Canada doesn't care that much. But he couldn't even force that rule on Vietnam. So the fact is, and I watched the process of these negotiations, that many of the rules that the U.S. wanted, other countries said, no, we don't like those rules. We're not going to play by your rules, and they negotiated and they failed. So the answer, when we say that China's not playing by the rules, it's partly true, but it's partly that they aren't playing by the rules that we wanted to have created, but we failed to do. There's one more reality that one needs to add to the perspective around the world of the WTO. We've never faced, in some ways, a crisis that is more important than the pandemic. Now that we're over it, we can look back with some kind of equanimity. Oh yes, we managed our way through. But put yourself, if you can remember, back in February, March of 2020, we didn't know how bad it would be, how long it would last, how many people would die. Many of you are not from New York, but if in New York City, every 10, 15 minutes, we would hear a siren. So you were staying in your apartment, and all you knew, you felt like you were under siege. They're constant, sirens were going on constantly as people were going to the hospital and dying. And you knew that was going on. So it was imperative at that moment to have the vaccines and therapeutics. We were doing research, and we knew that as long as the disease existed, fester somewhere in the world. There would be mutations, and those mutations could come back, and they could be more dangerous, more contagious. So we wanted, it was in our interest to do everything to contain that disease. And then the question came, at this vital moment, did our trade rules help us? And the answer was the intellectual property provisions of the WTO were a disaster. Because, the government had funded an enormous amount of research that had created the mRNA platform. They funded an accelerated program to translate the mRNA platform into a vaccine. There were therapeutics being developed. It was really a success of science, and let me say it was global science. If you look at each of the ventures, they were people from all over the world working together to solve a global problem. And in that way, one of the most important aspects of globalization, the globalization of ideas, really did work. But our private drug companies didn't want to cooperate. And the rules of the WTO gave them the weapon. So India and South Africa asked for a waiver of intellectual property rights for the duration of the pandemic. And by a waiver, let me make it clear, it was not a change in the legal framework. They would still get compensated. They get compensated at a normal competitive rate. There had always been a provision for compulsory licensing, so the principle had been well established. But the drug companies had figured out how to use the legal system to drag their feet. So they had used the legal system, so you apply for a compulsory license, and then they sued, and bureaucratic process were such that it would take several years. And that was why a waiver was required. It was not a change in the legal framework, it was a change in the speed with which things were done. And we were in an emergency, and speed was essential. Now, some of us were able to persuade President Biden to support the waiver, but we couldn't get several of the countries in Europe, Germany and Switzerland and UK in particular, to go along with the waiver. Almost the whole rest of the world, more than 100 countries said, yes, we need a waiver. And Switzerland, Germany, UK vetoed it. And the result is that lots of people died, many more people were hospitalized, the disease spread, and it was not even in our interest. So the lesson of this terrible story is that our international trade rules put profits over lives. But the implication was a lot of anger in a lot of countries. And it is, when I go around the world, I hear lots of developing countries, you ask, and emerging markets, you ask, why aren't you supporting the U.S. and Europe on the position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine? I don't know if you know, there's been a lot of disappointment that while a lot of countries are abstaining in the UN votes on these issues. And U.S. is getting, not the support we had hoped. We would have thought everybody would support this basic issue. One country invades another country. That seems, right and wrong often is blurry, but this was one where there was no blurriness. There was no way you could take an ambiguous position on that, and yet many countries are abstaining at the UN. And part of it is we don't want to get into this dogfight. And when our lives were at stake, you weren't on our side. You can't underestimate how important that was. And in fact, you know, I know for a fact that, you know, Pfizer would go to some countries and say, we will only sell you the good if you violate your basic principles of transparency in procurement, so that we can charge you an exorbitant price and nobody will know it. And I know at least one country that said, no, we'd rather take the vaccines from Russia, even if it's not as good a vaccine. Finally, in South Africa, they used the Freedom of Information Act to find out what was going on, and they discovered that they were charging a higher price to South Africa than they were charging to Europe and America, that they were exploiting these poor countries, and they were putting obligations on the countries without saying that there would be any penalty for their not delivering. So the pandemic was, you might say, a really, I don't want to say a death blow, but it certainly undermined confidence in the international regime because it was so inequitable. And it was so clear that so many countries put, Western countries put profits over lives. Well, more broadly, I said that there's been a change in ideology. All of this has contributed to the view that our system, our beliefs about neoliberalism and the trade regime that it supported have problems. But meanwhile, in the economics profession, has come to largely reject neoliberalism as a framework of thinking about it. The externalities which it ignored are first order importance. There's innovation which it ignored is first order importance. Risk is first order. There's a market showed a lack of resilience which contributed to the inflation that we faced. Market power is pervasive, related in some sense to the structure of production. And exploitation is first order. The neoliberal order led to massive inequality, the opioid crisis, childhood diabetes crises, financial crises. Market created all these problems and won't solve it. So the problem is that the international regime was based on a set of ideas of neoliberalism, and now that ideology has been lost ascendancy, the structure of agreements, intellectual property rights, investments, trade rules, all of these have to be rethought, and confidence in those rules, in fact, those rules clearly are wrong. So that brings us to the final question. I don't know how many, I don't have a watch and there's no clock here. Oh, so the question is, I've tried to frame it in a very general way. All of these issues are obviously very important to Latin America. The question is, where do you go from here? And I emphasized already the importance of de-risking, but there are a broader set of questions of what are some of the further policy implications. So I'll list a few and hopefully just open up the door. In a few minutes, one can't go through all the implications. The first is Latin America's voice needs to be heard in demanding a rewriting of the rules. in particular, for instance, an end of the investment agreements, new international tax agreement, new intellectual property rights, new frameworks for almost every one of the issues that constitute the globalization framework. Let me just give you a couple examples of the problems and the approaches. For instance, investment agreements originally were thought of as ways of protecting against expropriation. But there have been almost no expropriations. I mean, let's put Venezuela aside, and there are, but there have been almost no expropriations. It's not a relevant issue. And expropriation, you can get insurance from MIGA, which is a branch of the World Bank, from the United States. That's not the problem. What investment agreements do is restrict government's ability to regulate. Because regulations, if you change a regulation, it has the effect of diminishing the profits that you have, and you can be sued in the investor-state dispute framework. But a basic function of government is to regulate. When these investment agreements were originally designed, one of the lawyers who played an important role in writing these agreements said proudly, and just quite amazing, if we put plutonium in baby cereal, we've designed an agreement to make sure you can't stop us from doing that. I mean, it was what he was trying to say is, we've protected you against any regulations. Well, what is the regulation that many of us are very concerned about? We need to have regulations to move to the green transition. We have to have regulations against fossil fuels. And those regulations can't be stopped by suits. I mean, right now, they can be stopped. That's the problem. And actually, it's very interesting. There are a set of agreements within the European countries that are very similar. And all of a sudden, Europe has discovered that their signing these investment agreements is leading to lots of suits. Germany shut down its nuclear power plant, sued. You can disagree or agree, but the government's right to undertake energy policies to protect its citizens should be paramount and not subject to suit. Courts in the United States have said that. But international investment agreements tie your hands. And so Europe is withdrawing from its own investment agreements, but at the same time holding those emerging markets to their investment agreements. So that's one thing that obviously has to change. The international tax system is designed to facilitate tax avoidance. It's a transfer price system. So you get to make up, the question is, where is the value added created? And it just so happens that most of the value added is created in those places that have low taxes, according to American corporations. So Apple and Google have created products that people love, but they've been even more clever in avoiding taxes. And many of you may know the example where 300 employees or so, 350 employees in Ireland were given credit for all the profits that Apple made all over Europe. And then say quirk, but it was deliberately put there, in Irish law said that if those 350 people in Ireland had direction from Silicon Valley, they didn't even have to pay taxes in Ireland. So the tax rate in Ireland is 12, it was lower than elsewhere, it's 12% or so. But then this quirk said they don't even have to pay that. And so the Apple paid 0.2% taxes on its European profits. This is the richest country in the world, a company in the world, and yet it was not. It had depended on research that public paid for, on educated people that the public paid for, and it wasn't paying back. The fact that the international tax regime worked so poorly led even the United States to say something ought to be done about it, especially after the 2008 crisis. Developing countries said, you're robbing us of our income. You told us to open our doors to foreign investment. It would contribute to your growth, but they refused to contribute to our tax base. So there began a process in the OECD, the club of the rich countries, to create a new tax system, global tax system. It was called BEPS, Base Erosion and Profit Shifting, recognizing that corporations had this, under the transfer price system, had this ability to transfer money, pretending that it originated in low tax jurisdictions so it would not be taxed. Now, when I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors back in the 90s, early 90s, this issue had come, I got interested in this issue because I thought the system was broken. And I tried to change it. But it was one of my many failures. The arguments were, I thought, overwhelming, but even more overwhelming was corporate power. And so nothing happened until the BEPS process. And not a surprise, if you have a process that is being conducted in the club of the advanced countries, what do you think the outcome is going to be? Is it going to be a redistribution of taxing powers to the developing countries and emerging markets to give them more revenue, which is the reason I wanted it in the first place? The answer is no. And what came out is a set of proposals that I think is worse than nothing. Well, it has two parts to it, let me say. One is pillar one, is a global minimum tax, stopping the race to the bottom. I think that was a great thing. But the rate it set was 15%, and then they gave a lot of exceptions and deductions, and so the actual effective rate was more like 12.5%. The average corporate tax rate in Latin America is 28%, or something like that. And so it was irrelevant for Latin America. In fact, I worry that if you set a global minimum tax at a particular rate, 15%, that will wind up as the maximum tax. And if that should happen, then a movement to raise the tax revenues will wind up lowering tax revenues. But at least the concept was right, and it was done in a way. The United States adopted a version of this, and we have a global minimum tax now for firms operating in the United States. And Europe should do the same, and so that part was good, although not at the right rate and with too many exceptions. But the other part was called Pillar 1. It has to do with allocating taxing rights. Where does the money, where does the economic activity originate, so who can tax what? And that, there was a lot of lack of transparency. We still don't know all the details, and in this area, the devil is in the details. The OECD is asking countries to sign on to an agreement that they don't know what the agreement is. But we know enough of it to know that there will be almost no revenue going to developing countries and emerging markets. And we know the principles underlying the agreement are not based on economics. The principles are designed to get more revenue, to prevent more taxes on big tech, for instance. So one of the key provisions is that if you sign on to this agreement, you are not allowed to impose digital taxes. So you're giving away your right to tax in return for almost nothing. And of course, digital taxes will be becoming more and more important going forward. So you're giving up the growth revenues in return for virtually nothing. And they're asking countries to sign on to this agreement. And my view is they shouldn't. Now, there was an important initiative in Cartagena this summer where the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean got together and said, our voice was not being heard in tax reform, and we need to cooperate together to have a forum for tax reform. ECHO is going to house that initiative, a very important, CEPAL, I should, a very important initiative. So that's an example of rewriting the rules in ways that reflect the interests, and I would say economic science of today. Let me just list very quickly some of the other reforms, and I don't know if you want to have time for questions, or I'm probably talk too long. Let me. One of the IMF was established to help countries manage financial crises and to stabilize the global economy. But one of the things is that the IMF has become a lender, which is policies with pro-cyclical, making fluctuations worse, charging high interest rates. Obviously, the problem has gotten worse as interest rates have risen. Countries now have to pay, some countries, like Ukraine, will have to pay 8% interest. This is supposedly a low interest rate loan. And who are the countries that have to pay the high interest rates? The countries that are most in trouble. And they say, well, they shouldn't borrow so long. Well, Ukraine can't help. They'd like Russia to leave. But they can't guarantee when it's going to leave, and they can't guarantee when their economy will be back on the feet. And yet, they will have to continue to pay 8% interest. I think this is unconscionable, and is an example of where the IMF rules have to change if we're going to have a better globalization. Obviously, there has to be cooperation on climate, much stronger policies. But there are several environmentally related policies that where the conflict between the advanced countries and the emerging markets is shaping up in a very, I say, difficult way. Let me give you two examples most strongly illustrated by Indonesia, but it's also true in many of the Latin American countries. Europe has taken the view that it doesn't want imports of agricultural goods from land that's deforested. So if Indonesia wants to export, say, palm oil, there has to be a certificate showing that the land was not deforested. They haven't explained how you're going to get these certificates, who's going to do it, how do you verify it? And there's another element that is a kind of irony. Europe deforested Europe a long time ago. So it says, if you did deforestation 100 years ago, you're okay. You're just not allowed to do what Europe did 100 years ago. You know, if the big mistake was not ruining your forest earlier, and we're going to punish you for not doing it earlier. It's absurd. And it turns out it's not very effective, but it's very costly. So that's one example where there's conflict, and it will touch Latin America because there will be goods produced in the Amazon or other places, and they'll say, prove that it wasn't deforested. The second thing, on the other side, Indonesia has lots of natural resources, as Argentina, as Latin America does, and they are very committed to the idea that they don't want the neo-colonial relationship to continue. What I mean by that, the neo-colonial relationship was where you exported raw materials, and all the processing and value added occurred in the advanced countries. And colonialism officially ended a long time ago, but this relationship, the neo-colonial relationship, continued. And it continued because actually WTO embedded a lot of these ideas. They call it escalating tariffs that were designed to make sure that emerging markets in developed countries stayed just producing raw materials. Well, Indonesia said, we don't like this. We have a lot of nickel, and we want to make sure that the value added occurs in Indonesia. So they passed a law saying that there's no export of raw nickel. Well, not a surprise, Europe objected. They said this is an interference of free trade. But it's been an enormous benefit to Indonesia. It developed, Sulawesi island that was not very developed, has really boomed as a result of that, as a result of the value added. Now, I say this, I mention this example because many of the Latin American countries have lithium, copper, other raw materials that are essential for our 21st century renewable economy. So far, it's been very hard to get the development of those value-added activities. And we had a little debate when I was in Indonesia a couple weeks ago about, should they have the ban versus a tariff? And the conclusion, it's supported by the finance minister who was well-educated in the West and who had believed that, taxes would be better, said the ban has worked miracles that no export tax would have enabled. So at least U.S. has industrial policies to promote the green economy and to promote its own economy, to promote jobs. Industrial policy is back. After having U.S. having attacked it for 40 years. And now Latin America, I think, has to think again about how to create industrial policy that will use natural resources for the benefit of the people in Latin America. Now, one particular aspect of this that I think has been underappreciated is that most mining activities have negative externalities, pollution of one form or another, social costs of people being moved around. So there are external costs that the mining companies don't bear. But the countries of Latin America, and it's true of other developing countries and emerging markets, don't charge the companies for the cost that they're imposing on society. And what does that mean? What it means is that Latin America, developing countries, emerging markets all over the world, are subsidizing the North. They're bearing the cost, but that's not reflected in the price. And when you do that, you are effectively subsidizing advanced countries. So for decades, the poor have been subsidizing the rich. And I think we are at a moment we can think about this in a more objective way and say the framework of the WTO didn't recognize this. And we now, as we rethink the international rules, ought to think about how we can make sure that the countries that produce the natural resources get fully compensated for all of the costs associated with producing them. There are two final points I want to make, which are an amplification of this. Industrial policies are back on the scene, and industrial policies represent, in some sense, pushing new technologies, new ways of producing it, new sectors that the market would not have otherwise done. So the question is, the U.S. is spending $1 to $1.5 trillion to move the market economy in a particular way. We don't have a market economy anymore. We never did, but we have an economy that is shaped very strongly by the government with $1 to $1.5 trillion of subsidies trying to move it in a way I think is right. So the challenge for Latin America and the Caribbean, you're not sitting on $1 to $1.5 trillion that can move the economy, so you're going to have to be smarter. The way we designed our policies was not smart, but you have to be smarter, so to think about how you can do it in a better way, but you're going to have to do it. And part of that is going to be to develop science and technology that's appropriate for Latin America and the Caribbean. And so I just leave it with the thought that how can Latin America and the Caribbean use knowledge and new policies, given the resource constraints, to reshape the economy in the direction of the new globalization. Thank you.